Chapter 11, the Nervous System Integration and Control, Screencast 5. Now, this is the last of 5 screencasts for Chapter 11, and it's going to be covering the central nervous system. It's going to be a little longer than the previous ones. I didn't really find a good split overall. So let's take a deeper dive, and there's a couple of things we want to keep in mind here when we're talking about the central nervous system. Remember, it's made up by 2 structures, the brain and the spinal cord, and very well protected. And that kind of makes sense. You really want to protect things that are this important and integral to function. So when we look at the primary protection for the central nervous system, a lot of it is bony in nature. So I have the skull and the vertebral column. So those together are very formidable structures which are going to protect the brain and spinal cord. The meninges, these actually act as protective membranes. And what you want to know is outermost to innermost. So the outermost is the dura mater, the arachnoid is the middle, and the pia is the innermost. This actually is going to be physically attached to either the brain or the spinal cord. Also, there's cerebral spinal fluid, and this is the fluid that's actually bathing the brain, and this fluid acts as a shock absorber. Now, the fluid is also produced by the ventricles within the brain, and we've heard the term ventricles before. I want you to think ventricles as a chamber. It's a space, okay? And another good example of a protective feature is what's called the blood-brain barrier. And this actually prevents entry of certain chemicals and pathogens. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you have something that is lipid soluble, it's going to cross the blood-brain barrier because, once again, that's not going to stop it. So things that are lipid soluble, such as alcohol, perfect example, and we know that alcohol has significant impact on the central nervous system and acts as a depressant. Now here we can see a couple of things here. So we see the brain and the spinal cord together, and these are the ventricles. So these are those areas where we actually see the cerebral spinal fluid being produced, okay? Here, if we look at the skull, we can see the meninges, so the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. And there's that space, okay, that space in which the cerebral spinal fluid is circulating. And so here you can actually see it's a fairly complicated circulatory system for cerebral spinal fluid. Many of you may have had a spinal tap in the past, and what that does is actually they're taking a sample of cerebral spinal fluid to see if there's any infections. Now, when we think about the spinal cord, we want to think of information going up and down. Okay, that's really what it's looking at. So it really is a superhighway that's connecting the brain with the rest of the body. And remember, we're talking about a structure that's part of the central nervous system. Now, we describe the matter. Okay, this is another term that is very specific to the central nervous system. I have white matter. That's the outer portion of the spinal cord, and that's actually myelinated tissue. So it's ascending, that's sensory, and descending is motor. And then I have the gray matter, and specific to the spinal cord, this is the central portion of the spinal cord, and this is where you're actually going to find the cell bodies and dendrites of the neurons that are found within the central nervous system. Now here we can see a couple of things. So we see the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is protective in nature. So let's kind of take a look here. So we have the spinal cord here. So here's the vertebrae providing that protection, and in between each vertebrae is an intervertebral disc. Here we can actually see a ganglion and the nerve. Remember, nerves are peripheral overall. And then we can also see the various layers. Okay, so we can see the pia, the arachnoid, and the dura. Okay, so here you're also looking the interactions. Okay, these are the facets. So there's a lot of joints that we see where vertebrae interact with each other. Now, this here is a cross section of the spinal cord, and you want to have the correct orientation. So this is posterior, this is anterior. So there's the dorsal horn, there's the ventral horn. And remember what I said previously, dorsal is sensory and ventral is going to be motor. and there's the central canal, and so on. And we can see the white matter and the gray matter. So all of that is the basic anatomy of the spinal cord. And we're just looking at a cross section here. And so remember, we're talking about a continuous structure. Now, the brain is the ultimate command center and integration area of the body. It's made up of three general anatomical functional areas. The hindbrain, this is going to coordinate basic, automatic, and vital tasks. Quite often you're going to find cardiovascular control center, respiratory control center. Those are located within the hindbrain. Then I have the midbrain, and that's responsible for the coordination of muscular activity and muscle groups. And it's also going to be an area that's specifically responsive to sight and sound type stimulus. And then the forebrain. This is the most advanced part of the brain. That's the part that actually is receiving information. It's the true integration center. And this is where all complex behavior is actually determined within the forebrain. Now, the hindbrain, this is the oldest and most primitive part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. There's three general areas that make up the hindbrain: the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, and the pons. So you should be comfortable with identifying these structures overall. Here you will have a diagram that I'll make sure that is available, and you can see the major areas of the brain. So you can see the cerebrum, which is the biggest part of the brain. The corpus callosum, this is actually connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. Here we can see the midbrain, and then the hindbrain. So there's the pons, there's the medulla oblongata, and that is going to be continuous to the spinal cord. And then the cerebellum. You do not want to confuse this with the cerebrum. Okay, two very distinctly different areas. And notice the cerebellum is part of the hindbrain and the cerebrum is part of the forebrain. Really, really important distinctions. Now, as I said about the medulla, that's continuous to the spinal cord, and really this is our control center. Our lots of life support systems are actually located here. So the cardiovascular control center, the respiratory control center. Now, the other thing that's happening within the medulla oblongata is our motor nerves are actually crossing over in this area. So this is important. The right forebrain controls the left side of the body, and the left forebrain controls the right side of the body. You may know someone that's actually suffered from a stroke, and if the stroke happens to be on the right side of the body, the right side of the brain, the left side of the body is what's going to be impacted, and vice versa. So that's a really important distinction that you want to make sure that you are comfortable with regarding the medulla and this crossover of the motor neurons that actually takes place at this level, at the level of the medulla. Now, the cerebellum, this is an area that's responsible for coordinating basic body movements. It's basically where the brain stores and replicates skilled movements. Examples would be most sports activities, so cycling, swinging a bat, but simple things such as tying a shoe or using a keyboard. So all of these are mediated at the level of the cerebellum. Now, this is an area that alcohol especially functions. And so one of the things that they do is basically a test of coordination and things like that to see if someone has consumed too much alcohol. And really, they do this because they know that alcohol significantly impacts the function of the cerebellum. And once again, coordination and typical movements are going to be impacted by the ingestion of alcohol. Now, the pons, this is kind of a connecting area. This is also, we kind of want to think of as the filter, because as I said before, remember, we don't respond to everything. So kind of imagine if you responded to every single sensory input that you're experiencing. We'd go crazy. So we actually have a filter, and it's kind of within the pons. And this is kind of connecting the higher brain centers and the spinal cord. So this is where we see the coordination of flow of information between the cerebellum and higher brain centers. And we can kind of think of it also playing a role or helping out the medulla with regards to regulation of respiratory function. Now, the midbrain, so here this is vision, hearing, sleep, wakefulness. So you're going to see the coordination of movement of the head. So kind of imagine one of the things, if you hear a loud noise, basically that's going to cause your head to turn, move, and so on. Very, very common. Here we're going to see how eye movement is actually going to be controlled here, size of pupils. A very common test when someone has suffered a head injury or head trauma is to look at how the pupils react to light. You want them to react equally. When your pupils do not react equally, there's generally an issue that you have some issues or trauma to higher levels of the brain. Now, within the midbrain, this is also where we're going to see neurons that are involved in our sleep-wake cycles. One group of neurons, the steady stream of action potentials to cerebrum, that's responsible for our awake and alert stages. And then there's another group of neurons in the sleep center, and they actually release the neurotransmitter serotonin, and that plays a role in inducing sleep. Now, here we're basically looking at levels of sleep. One of the things that many of you have are fitness trackers. I have an Apple Watch, and one of the things that you can kind of check out with your Apple Watch is keep track of sleep and quality of sleep. There's a number of apps out there that play a role breaking down the type of sleep, the quality of sleep, deep sleep versus light sleep, and so on. Here, you're basically looking at measuring brain activity during sleep. So first is wakefulness, and then we see the differences between deep sleep and REM sleep. And REM sleep is rapid eye movement. Now, we spend different amounts of time in each sleep phase. So a night is made up of going in and out of the various phases of sleep. Now, these deeper levels of sleep, as far as deep sleep and REM or rapid eye movement sleep, these are important because they impact the quality of sleep. And one of the things that happens during these deeper levels of sleep is the body's producing more neurotransmitters. So now we're moving on to the forebrain. This is the area that's responsible for all of our emotions and conscious thought. So here, this is where the majority of information is coming in and integrated overall. Now, the hypothalamus, we've kind of talked about that. That's going to act as a bridge with the endocrine system. So we're going to come back to this a little bit later. But also, a lot of our behavioral functions related to homeostasis are controlled here. So that's really important. The thalamus, this is an area where receiving, processing, and transfer. So think of it as the relay area, okay, overall. I have the limbic system. This is the area that's especially involved with emotions and memory. And then the largest part of the forebrain is the cerebrum. And this is the highest level of the brain where language, decision-making, all of our conscious thought is housed within the cerebrum. Now, as noted previously, if we look at the limbic system, and this is one of those areas that it's probably one of the least understood areas of the brain. And this is where we see a lot of our emotional behavior and motivational drives are housed within the limbic system. Now, the hypothalamus also plays a role here. Okay, so it's actually a gateway to and from the limbic system. Now, emotions sit within the limbic system, so fear, anger, sorrow, love, those. Basic behaviors, more of these are associated with the hypothalamus as far as food and thirst, but we also see those within the limbic system and sexual gratification. Now, these behaviors of the limbic system are actually modified by the cerebrum. Here we can see a couple of areas of the brain, and I want to point some things out. So green is the limbic system, and it's made up of a couple of areas. Now this small area here, don't let size confuse you, that's the hypothalamus. And as I said, the hypothalamus is an especially important part of the brain. It's a bridge to the endocrine system. We actually see a lot of autonomic control is regulated here, so very, very important. But look at the other areas. So how large the cerebrum is. We can see the thalamus, okay, the corpus callosum, that's basically neural tissue that's connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. So these are also structures that you should be able to label given a diagram. Now, as I said previously, the cerebrum deals with higher brain function, and it's made up of two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and they're connected together by the corpus callosum. And so the nerve fibers that exist within the corpus callosum, that actually allows the two hemispheres to communicate and share information. Now, the cerebral cortex, now this is gray matter, and this is actually the outer layer of the cerebrum. Now, we're going to take a deeper look at the cerebral cortex, and there's a number of really important functions that are associated with here, and there's lobes. And so you want to be able to identify the lobes of the cerebral cortex and what type of information is processed within these lobes. But overall, the function of the cerebral cortex is going to be memory storage, abstract thought, conscious awareness, and also conscious control of skeletal muscle. Now, the four lobes are as follows. The occipital lobe, that's where visual information is processed. The temporal lobe, this is where auditory information is interpreted. Also, the ability to comprehend spoken and written language. The parietal lobe, that's responsible for the reception and interpretation of sensory information from the skin. And then I have the frontal lobe, and that's responsible for the initiation of motor activity, speech, conscious thought, and so on. Now, all four lobes actually play a role when it comes to memory. So let's kind of take a look here. So you want to be able to identify, okay, the various lobes for the most part. So here we can see the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the frontal lobe, and the temporal lobe. And they've used a color code system. And this is a really good diagram to identify the lobes of the cerebral cortex, but also to identify the functions that are associated with each. So that's definitely something you want to be comfortable with overall. Now here, this is kind of a creepy diagram, and it's called homunculus. And what we're looking at here, so in red, this is the motor cortex, and then the blue is our sensory cortex. And notice they're not very big areas, okay? So they kind of go across the two cerebral hemispheres, and get your orientation correctly. So this is anterior, posterior. So there's the occipital lobe. And really what they're showing here is how much of a particular area of this cortical area is responsible or for these various areas. So if we look at touch, face, a very large part of the cortex is devoted to that. And then we can kind of see things on the sensory side. Okay, I'm just using this to kind of show you this isn't something that I would ask you to memorize. I do want you to know that there's two cortex areas. There's a primary motor cortex and a primary sensory cortex. That I think is really important, and I do want you to be comfortable with that. Now, when we talk about memory, there's generally two different types of memory. We have short-term versus long-term. Short-term, now that's working memory. And so this is information from the previous few hours, and this memory is generally stored within the limbic system. Then we have long-term memory. This is information from a long-term basis from days to years. And one of the things that happens depending upon our memory, permanent changes in neurons and development of synapses related to memory that are occurring within the cerebral cortex. So you want to be comfortable with short-term versus long-term memory. Now, another area are those drugs that are considered to be psychoactive. Now, our textbook is using a very, very broad definition of psychoactive. So basically anything that's going to impact states of consciousness, emotions, and behavior. A lot of times, a lot of people would refer to psychoactive drugs as psychedelics. So drugs such as LSD, the active, when you're talking about mushrooms, psilocybin, those being psychoactive, but our textbook is not looking at those. Some neurotransmitters and things like that are always going to be thought of as psychoactive. So I want to make sure that I make that distinction. Now, they're using the very generic definition of psychoactives as any drug that affects states of consciousness, emotions, or behavior. Now, the action, so these are drugs that specifically can cross the blood-brain barrier, and they're going to influence concentrations or actions of neurotransmitters, and that may change the normal patterns of electrical activity within the brain. Now, you may be familiar with the recreational drug ecstasy, and ecstasy, what it does, it actually results in a large release of the neurotransmitter serotonin. Okay, they're also considering antidepressants. Some of you may know people that are on serotonin reuptake inhibitors or norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Those are drugs that are very commonly used to treat depression. Overall, the impact of these psychoactive drugs is to affect higher functioning of the brain. Now, there's a number of things that are characteristic of these. Psychological dependence. So now the user craves those feelings that are associated with the drug. The concept of tolerance. What tolerance implies is more and more of that substance is necessary to achieve the same effect. Then we look at addiction versus withdrawal. Now, addiction, basically, those individuals need to continue to obtain and use that particular substance. Now, I think it's really important. Chances are many of you know addicts. This is not free choice. This is a really big deal. Then, if we look at withdrawal, and withdrawal are those specific physical symptoms that are associated that someone experiences when they stop taking one of these drugs. Now, we're going to end with disorders of the nervous system. And there's a couple of things here that I want to spend some time with. I think trauma, concussions, what we now know about trauma to the central nervous system, the brain in particular. There are very, very strict protocols now in how concussions are handled. And generally, when someone gets a blow to the head, that risks the potential for a concussion. Some of them can actually result in unconsciousness. And really what they're seeing is an overall disruption of the electrical activity within the brain itself. Now, another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about trauma to the brain, the skull prevents the brain from expanding. So swelling of the brain is really, really dangerous. Okay? Concussions are very different now than when I was a child. This might actually explain a couple of my behavioral quirks that I know of. I've actually had 3 concussions. The most severe concussion actually happened when I was a little kid. And to this day, I don't know what happened. I basically woke up in a hospital. Okay? I don't remember why I was in the hospital. I don't remember what happened to me. But I was let go after a day of observation. That's not the case now. If someone experienced that severe of a concussion, they would be under significant protocols. They would be kept in the dark. They would not be allowed to go to school, those things. So we now know quite a bit about concussions. And so wearing a helmet for almost anything, if we're talking about just skating, hockey, all of those. And we know there's a lot of controversy about some of the collision sports and the risk for concussions. If we look at soccer, which involves heading the ball, there are actually rules now where children of a certain age should not be allowed to head the soccer ball because of the potential damage and trauma associated with that. If we know people that have spinal cord injuries, these spinal cord injuries typically result in paralysis related to the area where the trauma actually is. There's a number of infections that are specific to the nervous system. Encephalitis, this is actually inflammation of the brain that's caused by viral infections. This is something, there's a number of these encephalitises that are actually transmitted by mosquitoes. Meningitis, this can actually be caused by either viral or bacterial infection. This is an inflammation of the meninges. Whenever you see itis, that is an inflammatory condition. Rabies, this is a viral disease that's spread by bite or saliva of an infected animal. And this virus actually spreads from the bite to the brain, and that's through the path of sensory neurons. There are brain tumors. These are actually abnormal growths in or on the brain. Okay. Epilepsy, here we're looking at an issue with the electrical activity. And some people have these severe seizures, and that's very abnormal activity within the brain. Chances are you probably know someone that has Alzheimer's disease. This is the most common cause of dementia, and it's associated with the accumulation of a plaque. It's an abnormal protein, beta amyloid, and things that are associated with Alzheimer's are progressive lapses of memory and dementia. Parkinson's, this is actually a disease that involves those neurons that producing dopamine. So you specifically lose those particular neurons. This is a progressive degenerative disorder that impacts motor activity. We are not meeting face to face, and one of the things that sometimes is very noticeable about me is I have a tremor. And I was actually tested for Parkinson's disease at a very young age because a tremor is one of those things that is very much associated with Parkinson's disease. Here, we're looking at a PET scan. And what a PET scan does, this actually measures activity areas within the brain. And so in this healthy brain, you see those areas of highest activity, red and yellow. Now, over here on the right, this is a PET scan of an individual with Alzheimer's disease. And what you can see here is a significant decrease in those active areas and also a lot of irregular patterns and pathways that are due to the presence of the Alzheimer's disease overall.